Here's an in-depth analysis of the content, identifying key points of disinformation and explaining why the arguments presented in the discussion are deeply flawed and rooted in a primitive understanding of geopolitics. Analysis of the discourse. The conversation appears to be filled with aggressive rhetoric and classic propaganda techniques aimed at bolstering nationalist sentiment while demonizing the West, particularly NATO and countries like Germany and the United Kingdom. There is a clear attempt to rally the Russian populace around a narrative of victimhood and existential threat, which has been a cornerstone of Russian state-controlled media's approach, especially under the strain of ongoing conflicts. Rhetoric and false narratives. 1. Exaggeration of Western aggression. The speakers frame NATO and the Western countries as aggressors who are pushing Russia into a corner. This is a common tactic to justify Russia's aggressive actions, particularly in Ukraine, by portraying them as defensive measures. The reality is that NATO's actions have been primarily defensive, aimed at deterring further aggression after Russia's annexation of Crimea and ongoing destabilization of Ukraine. 2. Victimhood and call to arms. The rhetoric heavily leans on a narrative of Russia being under siege from the West, with calls for Russians to defend the motherland. This taps into historical Russian sentiments, particularly those from World War II, but it distorts the current geopolitical reality. The suggestion that Russia is being forced into a position where it must retaliate with extreme measures, including potentially using nuclear weapons, is both dangerous and unfounded. The West's support for Ukraine is grounded in upholding international law and the sovereignty of nations, not in a desire to dismantle Russia. 3. Denial of Ukraine's sovereignty. The discussion implies that Ukraine's successes are only possible because of Western support, dismissing the agency and determination of the Ukrainian people. This is a deliberate attempt to delegitimize Ukraine's right to self-determination and its capability as an independent nation. The portrayal of Ukraine as merely a proxy of the West undermines the legitimate struggle of Ukrainians for their sovereignty and independence. 4. Glorification of military aggression. The speakers express a desire to see Russian forces not only defend against perceived threats, but to advance into European capitals, such as Berlin and Paris, echoing imperialistic ambitions. This kind of talk is rooted in an outdated expansionist mindset that fails to recognize the modern principles of state sovereignty and international law. The glorification of past military conquests and the desire to see Russian troops in European cities is a dangerous and destabilizing rhetoric that ignores the catastrophic consequences of such actions. Number 5, primitive historical thinking. Putin and his propagandists often lean on historical narratives to justify current actions, but they do so in a way that is both selective and reductive. The obsession with historical borders and the perceived need to reclaim lost territories reflects a primitive understanding of geopolitics that ignores the evolution of international relations. Modern geopolitics is not about the expansion of empires, but about maintaining stability, peace, and respect for national sovereignty. 6. Threat of nuclear escalation. The casual talk about nuclear strikes, particularly on the UK, reflects a reckless disregard for the catastrophic consequences of such actions. This kind of rhetoric is designed to instill fear and project strength, but it also reveals a dangerous willingness to escalate conflicts to the point of no return. The notion that the West would capitulate or that Russia would emerge unscathed from such an escalation is not only false, but also dangerously naive. Conclusion. The discourse presented in this transcript is a clear example of how state-controlled media in Russia uses disinformation, historical revisionism, and aggressive rhetoric to manipulate public perception and justify the government's actions. The arguments are rooted in a primitive worldview that sees international relations as a zero-sum game of territorial expansion and military dominance, rather than a complex web of diplomatic, economic, and cultural interactions. The West, in contrast, operates on principles that prioritize international law, the sovereignty of nations, and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. While the West is not without its flaws, the underlying motivations behind its actions, particularly in supporting Ukraine, are legitimate and grounded in the defense of a rules-based international order. The disinformation propagated by figures like Vladimir Solovyov is designed to obscure these truths and rally support for an aggressive, expansionist agenda that ultimately threatens global stability.